Well, you were all very welcome here this evening to this on Cumann Staire, the Historical Studies Society of the University of Galway's second lecture in their current series of lectures on the general theme of impactful Irish elections, or more specifically, impactful Irish general elections. And of course, the topic and the title of tonight's lecture is There Must Be Order, and it's in reference to the 1932 and the 1933 general elections. Two elections which were fought and were somewhat fraught in the manner in which they were contested. They were arguably, certainly the 1933 election is regarded generally as being one of the bitterest in the history of the state. But the 1932 election prior to that was not without event either. And of course it was the two elections, first 1932, which saw the coming to power of the anti-Treatyite Fianna Fáil party, and the first time in which Eamon de Valera became the president of the Executive Council and the premier in the Irish state. And then the subsequent year, in the 1933 election, that power was consolidated. Now, however, before we move on to the campaign of 1932 itself, it is important, of course, to consider the background. And those of you who were with us for our previous lecture under the title of Stability or Chaos, the 1927 general elections in the plural, because of course there were two elections in that particular year, you will recall that through our discussion in that lecture and at the conclusion, we concluded that it was two elections which effectively paved the road towards stability within the new Irish state. Prior to the June election of 1927, there had still been a relatively large recalcitrant anti-Treatyite element, specifically in the guise of Fianna Fáil, who were on the outside of constitutional politics proper. But after that June election, Fianna Fáil under Eamon de Valera moved into the Irish Free State Dáil, taking up its position as the opposition. And then, and whilst that initially did seem to create some instability within Parliament, because if you recall in that last election, or that last lecture, we mentioned that now the Cumann Gael party no longer had a clear majority in the Dáil, not even a clear working majority once Fianna Fáil entered Parliament. But the subsequent September election of that year was to rebalance issues a little bit, with the consequence that, if you recall, in that September election, both Cumann Gael and Fianna Fáil increased their seat tallies quite significantly, but very much importantly from the perspective of Cumann Gael, they increased their seat tally by 15, which did not again give them an outright majority, but when they combined with assistance from the Farmers' Party and a number of relatively sympathetic independents, it gave W.T. Cosgrave, the leader of Cumann Gael, a relatively stable majority and the ability to then govern in the Irish Free State for the next 5 years. But it also, of course, demonstrated to us, given the large vote share that Fianna Fáil also received, increasing its seat tally by 13 on the previous outing just a few months earlier, it meant that Fianna Fáil was now solidified and consolidated as the primary opposition party in Parliament, and therefore was in effect a government in waiting, or at least potentially anyway, a potential government in waiting at any rate. Now, there has been a general perception, and quite understandable in some respects, that Cosgrave's final administration from 1927 until 1932 was something of a lame duck administration. Partially, as I say, because of the precarity or the apparent precarity of his majority in the Dáil. Remember, relying on the Farmers' Party and some sympathetic independents to maintain a majority. However, as Professor Ciara Meehan has indicated, it was more a case of a party that was in flux rather than, or a government that was in flux, and a party, Cumann Gael, that was in flux rather than one that was truly a lame duck administration as we understand it. Because that administration did have some notable successes during those final years in government. For instance, the famous Shannon scheme, which was a huge investment in infrastructure, hydroelectric power plant on the Shannon estuary, and so that was a clear economic and infrastructural investment that was to have significant positive outcomes for the future, and was a demonstration of the government's ability to, as a lame duck administration, to increase or to create a heavy investment in infrastructure and to do so successfully. And of course, then in the more international plane, you had the Statute of Westminster. For those of you unfamiliar, this was essentially a statute passed by the British Parliament, but which in 1931, but which effectively allowed all dominions within the British Commonwealth to change any law that they wished within the Dominion even if that law had been originally imposed upon them, if you will, or given to them by the British government. And this was seen as a significant step forward for the Dominions in terms of increasing their domestic power, and to a certain extent then from the Irish state, its sense of sovereignty. Now, the British government at the time, however, would not have interpreted this as meaning that the Irish government could change the terms of the treaty, which was seen as an international agreement rather than domestic affairs. But as we shall see later, De Valera was to take a different perspective on this. And there were also arguably security successes in a way, or of a type, for this final Cosgrave administration as well, which I'll allude to in a moment. But suffice it to say now that in order to have had these security successes, it had to be a little bit more than simply a lame duck administration. So what were the challenges then that faced this final Cosgrave administration as it was running towards the end of its term and moving towards the 1932 general election? Well, it faced significant economic difficulties in the latter part of the administration. The Irish economy had actually been doing reasonably well in the years 27, 28 and up until 1929. Our agricultural exports were quite high. There was reasonably high prices for farmers for their goods, which they were largely exporting to the British market. And the Cosgrave government, depending on your perspective, for good or for ill, did have a particular talent for balancing the books and ensuring that the Irish state did not fall into debt. However, as a consequence of the Wall Street, not entirely as a consequence of the Wall Street crash, but a significant contributor to the economic difficulties was the Wall Street crash of 1929, which put the world, or at least the Western world, or non-socialist world as it were, the rest of the world outside the Soviet Union, into significant economic difficulty and a worldwide depression as it were. And it did impact Ireland. Not immediately, but certainly by the early 1930s, prices for agricultural goods plummeted, and there was significant economic and financial hardship here, particularly, again, as I say, amongst the farming community or those dependent on the agricultural sector. So much so indeed that it almost prompted the government to fall earlier than the election of 1932. Now, this is despite the fact that Cosgrave and the Commonwealth government did try to argue or try to put across to the electorate as much as they could, or to the general public, that the difficulties that they were facing and the increased cuts in public expenditure and some tax rises that had to occur in 1930 were not their fault, essentially. It was a consequence of the worldwide depression and the impact on Ireland. But as a former minister for, a former leader of the Labour Party here, Pat Rabbitte once said, this didn't butter too many parsnips with the public, who simply recognised that they were being badly treated or felt they were being badly treated by the government. So as I say, there were significant financial difficulties, and pressure was put on the government as a consequence then of Fianna Fáil inside the Dáil, together with the Labour Party, of course, for natural reasons, arguing against tax increases, or certainly tax increases on regular or staple goods, and of course public spending cuts. With the result that in March 1930, Fianna Fáil tabled a motion to increase spending on old age pensions. Well, understandable enough perspective. You want to increase the level of money in the pocket of the elderly, particularly in times of economic hardship. And of course, there had been the issues over shillings being taken off the old age pension earlier in the decade. So Fianna Fáil was trying to capitalise in a number of ways there, to put it up to the government that they should be more generous towards the elderly, but also to give themselves, Fianna Fáil, a certain degree of extra support within what you could call the less well-off sections of society. Now, as it transpired, the government lost the vote. So the motion put forward by Fianna Fáil resulted in Fianna Fáil's motion being won. It was in large part due to a certain degree of lethargy within the Cumann Gael party at that time, in that a lot of their members didn't turn up for votes. That's why they lost the vote, rather than because there was Cosgrave actually lacked a real majority in the real sense. But in any event, it angered Cosgrave greatly. He felt that he was put under a lot of pressure, and he and the rest of his cabinet resigned in March 1930. They actually said that they were resigning from government altogether and let Fianna Fáil and the Labour Party handle matters. Because from the point of view of Cosgrave and the Cumann Gael government, this increase in the old age pension, which I think would have amounted to maybe £300,000 in the year, which was a lot of money that time, very little these days, but a lot of money at that time, Cosgrave and the cabinet felt that it didn't make fiscal or budgetary sense and would put the state into debt, essentially. And it was too difficult to meet those payments. So they said, we're resigning, let Fianna Fáil and Labour handle it. But both Fianna Fáil and the Labour Party, unlike back in mid-1927, if you recall, where they almost came together to form a kind of a government back then, on this occasion, Labour and Fianna Fáil, although they support each other on many social issues and financial issues, they were now vying for the same opposition space within the Dáil and within the electorate. And they didn't get on as well at this stage in 1930 as they would later or did previously. And consequently, they couldn't agree to put De Valera forward as Taoiseach, and neither would Fianna Fáil agree to put forward the Labour leader, T.J. O'Connell, who was by then the leader of the Labour Party, forward as Taoiseach, President of the Executive Council either. With the result then that Cosgrave was to be returned essentially as leader of the government and as President of the Executive Council, because nobody else could get the votes for the job. So he was returned again within a few days, and consequently the government was to continue on from there. Now, there was also increased anti-treaty IRA activity in the early part of the 1930s. As I say, there had been some security successes in the earlier part of this final administration. 1927, 28 and 29 were relatively quiet years with respect to paramilitary activity. But around the year 1930, late 1929, early 1930, anti-treaty IRA increased significantly. And there was various incidents of violence involving that organisation in various parts of the country. And a particular attempt that the left-wing section of the anti-treaty IRA made at this time was to try to form a new political entity, a new political movement or machine that they could use, that the anti-treaty IRA could control, but could harness left-wing or socialist type views within the Irish state more broadly. And this became known as the Staire or Free Ireland organisation. This was seen very quickly by the government as being a communist threat in essence. Now, Staire was socialist in orientation, no doubt. The extent to which it was communist is quite open for debate. I mean, it wasn't communist. There might have been some communists in it, but it wasn't a communist organisation. But because it was the creature of the anti-treaty IRA, an organisation dedicated to overthrowing the state, and because it was also clearly socialistic in its intention, the government, being both fearful of anti-treaty IRA attacks and attempts to destroy the state, as well as being quite suspicious of socialist type ideas at this stage, regarded it as a dual threat or a double threat, if you will. With the result that they introduced a Public Safety Act, a new Public Safety Act in 1931, late 1931. Now, this Public Safety Act was quite draconian, as the language of the time would generally be. It had it gave significant extra powers of arrest to the Gardaí. It provided for internment. It established military tribunals that could take the place of ordinary courts for dealing with particular crimes, especially crimes of a paramilitary nature, and it allowed for widespread censorship if the government deemed it necessary. It also allowed the government to literally outlaw any organisation that the government felt, arguably, was a threat. So the parameters were quite wide there in which the government could outlaw organisations. And of course, the Staire organisation was immediately outlawed and very quickly suppressed as a consequence. Now, another challenge but as I say, this is a challenge the government overcame, and this is an example of how its approach towards security did not undermine its position within Parliament per se, because the Act was opposed by Fianna Fáil, who saw it as unnecessarily draconian legislation, partially attempting to attack kind of an ally of Fianna Fáil, the anti-treaty IRA, or a part-time ally of Fianna Fáil at any rate. And it was also opposed by the Labour Party and others within civic society as well. But the government had little difficulty getting it passed in Parliament. Quite a few independents and even a couple of members of the Labour Party who were security orientated or fearful of potential threats from Attira, they voted with the government. So again, the argument of a lame duck government is perhaps not quite accurate, I think. And then the next major, or the last major challenge you could argue, was the momentum of Fianna Fáil. After entering Parliament in 1927, Fianna Fáil had quickly adapted to constitutional politics, became very adept at it, and by the time you got to the early 1930s, the Fianna Fáil machine was both well organised, well oiled, and was gaining in popularity. But that being said, by the time we get to 1932, the year of the election itself, there was a general perception, not of a lame duck organisation or a lame duck government, but one which was staid and stubborn. The Public Safety Act, although it had been passed, was widely seen as an indication, by much in the public anyway, of the government's kind of insecurity. It was often seen as too slow to react to the worldwide economic crisis, and therefore too slow to introduce protectionist measures, the raising of taxes and tariffs in order to decrease the attractiveness of imports from abroad. but also to build up native industry. And many other countries were adopting these protectionist measures at around this time, but Ireland was quite slow to do so. Now, oftentimes Cumann Gael is seen as having been completely opposed to protectionism and opposed to tariffs on foreign goods, as it were. It's not strictly true. They did actually introduce some tariffs during their last years in power, but they certainly didn't embrace the idea of protectionism in the way that Fianna Fáil would or advertise it. And then there's a fair argument to be made that this final Cumann Gael administration, indeed all Cumann Gael administrations, almost eschewed or avoided or abjured popularity. Sometimes they took measures at times which were almost guaranteed to bring a lack of popularity or to make them unpopular with people, and it's as if they almost didn't care. At least that was the perception from some people's points of view. So for instance, in November 1931 they introduced a supplementary budget, what's sometimes known as an emergency budget, in which there was tax increases again and cuts in pay for teachers and Gardaí. And again, the Gardaí are the very bulwark and the backbone of the state security apparatus. It almost seemed like a foolish thing to do for a government in this position to be cutting their pay. And an argument could be made, why not consider waiting until after the election? That the election had to come in 1932, either early or late 32. Why not wait? And indeed, as Professor Michael Laffin has indicated, there was one Cumann Gael supporter who observed after the election that it was as if the government really desired, he observed after the election that if the government really desired a renewal of confidence, its actions immediately before the election bordered on lunacy. And that was the term he used. So his view was, what was the government doing just before an election, taking such unpopular measures? And then lastly, that could lead into the question, when to have the election and why call the election when Cosgrave did ultimately in January 1932. He dissolved the Dáil in January 1932 and the election was held in February. Why do it in early 1932 so soon after this unpopular budget had been introduced? Why not wait for a period of time to see if things would improve? And again, this is sometimes seen as an indication of the government's almost abjuration of popularity. It's just the right thing to do to introduce this budget, and it's the right thing to do to have this election now soon and get it out of the way, and it doesn't matter how popular or unpopular that is. Now that's not entirely true, because as it happened in early 1932, the cabinet received a memorandum from the Department of Finance which indicated to them quite clearly that the opinion of the Department of Finance was things were going to get a lot worse from a fiscal and budgetary perspective as 1932 progressed. And the election had to be that year, either early or late, you could argue, of 1932. So ultimately the government decided to opt for the early election before things, ironically, got even worse. Okay, so that was the state of play when, another reason why Cosgrave, opted to hold the election in early 1932 was because there was going to be an imperial conference in the summer of that year, in July 1932. Now, for those of you unfamiliar, they're now called the Commonwealth Conferences, essentially conferences of the various Dominion governments of the British Dominions at that time, or the British Commonwealth, would come together and discuss issues of mutual concern. And it had been at these very conferences that Cumann Gael and other Dominion governments had been successful in lobbying the British government, for example, to increase the sovereignty of the various dominions and the various home rule governments, if you will. And it was actually as a consequence of one of those imperial conferences that Statute of Westminster I mentioned earlier in 1931 was enacted. I don't think I emphasised that actually. That was seen as a success for Cumann Gael as well, to have been so involved in the process that brought about the Statute of Westminster. So because that imperial conference was coming in July, Cosgrave and the cabinet were of the view that we should have an election now so that there's a strong government, or at least a recognised government that would be in power for a while, that would be able to bargain at that conference, rather than a government that might be seen by the others as being potentially weak because it could soon be out of office. Okay, so what was the state of play when the election was called? Well, at the dissolution of the Dáil in January 1932, Cumann Gael had 65 seats. And the reason, there's a little asterisk there you might see, is because I'm including the Ceann Comhairle in that number. He was a Cumann Gael man. And they had managed to win actually a couple of by-elections in the early part of this final administration. Up until 1930, they'd actually won a couple of by-elections. They even won a by-election away from, they took a seat from Fianna Fáil actually on one occasion. So Cumann Gael were leaving with 65 seats. Fianna Fáil were leaving with 56 seats, the Labour Party with 10, The Farmers' Party with 6, but it should be noted at this stage in 1932, the Farmers' Party were something of a busted flush. They were not the kind of cohesive organisation. If they'd ever been, they certainly weren't by the time they reached 1932. Quite a lot of them were very sympathetic to Cumann na Gael and would end up joining Cumann na Gael at any rate. And then another section of the Farmers' Party would end up going in a different direction. So they were a party, and they were going into the election as a party, but they were a somewhat disparate bunch, in fairness. I have the National League up there as well with 2 asterisks. This is simply because, if you recall, they were there at the 1927 election. They'd gotten 2 seats, but by 1931 they had effectively dissolved, and again, their members, their 2 TDs, I think, one of their TDs certainly anyway, folded into Cumann na Gael, and a lot of their support base would have gone back to Cumann na Gael. But some of its support base would go in a different direction as well, which I'll allude to later. And there were 16 independents when that Dáil was dissolved. So in terms of the campaign itself then, the 1932 election campaign, again, it's kind of generally been regarded as one of the most bitter to that point in time. So it was one of the most bitter to date, with maybe the arguable exception of the 1923 election. But it was a rather contentious contest. There's no doubt about that. And it was fought in the heat of international depression and in rather depressing weather as well. There was some limited violence during the 1932 campaign, but nothing like what would be on the scale of the subsequent one. Though one notable example here of violence in the 1932 campaign is that an outgoing Cumann na Gael TD and a candidate for re-election was murdered or was killed during the election campaign, as was a Garda who was with them at the time. But despite the attempts by some in the government to try and link this into the idea of disorder in the country from opposition elements, in reality it was an internal and a personal matter, if you will. Not internal, but it was a personal matter, and it had nothing to do with Fianna Fáil or the anti-treaty IRA. So, as I say, a fraught and difficult election at times, but not one marred by significant levels of violence. So in terms of the various parties then, how did they campaign? Well, much like in 1927, or at least in the June election of 1927, in the September election of 1927, Cumann na Gael emphasised a very order versus anarchy, stability versus chaos, sanity versus suicide, this was a term that was used, type of approach. Very much an arguing that vote for us or essentially doom and destruction will befall you. Now granted, they did emphasise their own personal record to an extent. So they did attempt to emphasise the successes that they had had in government over the previous 10 years. But in terms of being an election campaign of hope or forward thinking for the future, there was very little of that. It was a combination of emphasising their own record and then contextualising Ireland's difficulties within the global depression and how it wasn't their fault essentially that the economy was doing so bad. But then the majority of the campaign, or the balance of it, was focused on a negative campaign against Fianna Fáil, and it was very much the clear choice between stability or chaos, as I say, sanity or national suicide. And they would argue that voting for Cumann na Gael is what helps to guarantee peace, safety and security. Voting for Fianna Fáil, or basically any of the primary oppositions, but certainly Fianna Fáil, will guarantee insecurity, war and indeed communism. There was a significant attempt by Cumann na Gael to try and paint De Valera in particular as a kind of a pawn for communism and as a Kerensky type figure who would, willingly or not, allow communist type ideology to enter into Ireland and to undermine our Christian heritage, etc. So terms like gunmen, communists, terrorists, destruction and disorder were regularly applied by Cumann na Gael candidates to the Fianna Fáil opposition. And Cosgrave himself was to use, once again, deploy what you could call religio security rhetoric on occasion. And at one point he said that Fianna Fáil, if returned to government, would release the communists and terrorists upon society and give full freedom to Staire era communism and the friends of Soviet Russia. So there's some images then from various posters that were utilised by Cumann na Gael during the campaign. And again, the poster campaign that was utilised by Cumann na Gael was primarily against Fianna Fáil rather than being for themselves or for something, or at least the more notable ones at any rate. And it was very much an anti-Fianna Fáil campaign that was being produced by Cumann na Gael. So what of the Fianna Fáil campaign then? Well, theirs was quite different. there were, of course, attacks by Fianna Fáil candidates on Cumann na Gael, etc., and I'll get to those in a moment. But the balance, or a large portion, or a significant factor, the significant element of Fianna Fáil's campaign was one of positivity in terms of the future, looking for change, bringing about a new dispensation. And of course, they focused on both bread and butter issues, or they emphasised both bread and butter issues and issues relating to sovereignty and, if you want, patriotism. So Fianna Fáil did play the green card again, as they had in previous outings. They promised they would remove the oath of allegiance that Irish parliamentarians were expected to swear to the Irish Constitution, and then the corresponding oath of fidelity to the British monarch. They also stated that they would retain the land annuities if they were returned to government. Now, for those of you who might recall from the previous lecture, the land annuities were effectively a kind of a mortgage payment that previous British administrations had given to Irish farmers in the turn of the 20th century, and which required the Irish farmers under that agreement to repay these mortgages. They became known as land annuities. This is for the Irish farmers to purchase the land that they lived on from absentee farmers. And it was agreed after the treaty and after the independent Irish state came into being that the Irish government will continue to collect these annuities from farmers on behalf of the British government and return them to London. This was part of the agreement. So Fianna Fáil was claiming that these were unjust and wrong, that we shouldn't be paying these, or Irish farmers should not be paying these annuities to Britain, and so therefore they promised to retain the annuities here and to invest them domestically. They also promised, of course, the usual of most oppositions, decreased taxes and decreased rates. They also promised to implement a protectionist programme in terms of the Irish economy. So I mentioned already, I've alluded to protectionist, the concept of building up native industry and protecting native industries and allowing them to flourish by putting high taxes and tariffs on imports from abroad. So that will, in theory, generate increased growth in a domestic industry, which provides jobs, provides money domestically, and keeps both the products, the production process, and the employment and the employment outcome here at home. And it's for the benefit of the domestic market. And again, protectionist policies and barriers have their champions and their opponents even today. So they also promised to eradicate waste in the public sector. It's usually a pretty popular one for opposition parties as well. They also, of course, promised to increase employment significantly and to embark on an expansive house building programme. Don't know if you've heard any of that recently either. Then on the green card element, as I say, to promote the Irish language, and of course the issue of partition remained a rhetorical device that Fianna Fáil will continue to use at election time for quite some time without arguably much ever being implemented in relation to it. So as I said, there were also, of course, attacks on Cumann na Gael by Fianna Fáil politicians. Cumann na Gael was generally accused of being pro-British and of sympathising with unionism, and of course was regularly associated with jobbery and waste by Fianna Fáil candidates. So Fianna Fáil ultimately had a very dynamic electoral campaign. There was a high morale amongst its activist base, and De Valera was very much pushed to the forefront as a kind of a presidential figure. This had been done before, if you recall, in the 1927 elections as well. De Valera was the dynamic or centrifugal force around which a lot of the campaign was circling. And he was the primary personality dynamic within it. And it's also noteworthy that Fianna Fáil at this time received significant assistance from the anti-treaty IRA during this campaign. Now, the anti-treaty IRA leadership did not come out in terms of being. They had no particular love for Eamon de Valera and no particular love for Fianna Fáil, but the leadership knew that there was still a significant overlap between many of its members and activists and the Fianna Fáil party. And the leadership knew that a lot of the anti-treaty IRA activists and rank and file were going to canvass for and work with and support Fianna Fáil during this campaign. So the anti-treaty IRA assisted by standing back, as in the leadership assisted by simply not precluding its members from assisting this Free State, if you will, party, or partial Free State party, because they're in Parliament, from having success in this particular election. And this assistance from the anti-treaty IRA or its members was of significant aid to Fianna Fáil at this time. Okay, so what about the Labour campaign then? Well, if you recall, Labour had essentially been demoted from the position of being the primary parliamentary opposition after 1927 as a consequence of Fianna Fáil coming in. And this was to, I suppose, undermine the morale of the party to a certain extent. And indeed, the parliamentary party itself was somewhat undisciplined during these years of 1927 to 1932. The man there that you see on the right, that's T.J. O'Connell. He's the man who was the Labour leader at this time because the former leader, Thomas Johnson, had lost his seat in the September 1927 general election, which of course was also a blow to the party. Johnson was an excellent parliamentarian. O'Connell was a capable man as well, but nevertheless, to have lost the leader in an election is never positive for a party. Furthermore, the Labour suffered from a rather limited activist base during this time, and arguably it's been a perennial problem for the Labour Party in this country, suffering from a limited activist base, because many of what would be regarded as a natural working class constituency gravitated towards Fianna Fáil, and this will continue to be the case until relatively recently at any rate. Now, Labour largely, it only ran 33 candidates in the election as well, which is you require 77 for a majority to be in government. So at this point in time, so it was clear from the outset that Labour were positioning themselves not to be a party of government, but to be a party of perhaps the balance of power, or maybe a potential coalition, junior coalition partner, if that was to be a possibility. So from the beginning, I mean, we're talking about a low morale campaign, if you will. And indeed, as Niamh Purcell has said, Labour's behaviour at the 1932 election belied any notions that it wished to increase support. It was so lackadaisical and lacklustre in its campaign. And as she also stated, its candidates stood in the election rather than fought in it. And indeed, T.J. O'Connell himself, or the Labour Party itself, essentially put itself forward to the electorate as endeavouring to compel any new government, whoever it was, to use the powers given by the treaty to reorganise the economic life of the people, most likely on left-wing lines, or to have some kind of a left-wing position to it with respect to Labour's natural perspective. And ultimately it advised its voters to give their transfers to Fianna Fáil. The Farmers' Party then, which I mentioned already, well, as I say, this was a party that was on the way out really in many ways in 1932, and in some cases there were both official farmers and independent farmers candidates vying for the same constituency or the same votes in various constituencies. However, many of the official Farmers' Party candidates tended to orientate towards Cumann na Gael, and they had been quite supportive anyway, as I mentioned in the last lecture, of Cumann na Gael while in Parliament during the years 22 to 32. Now, some independent and the official candidates, or the official Farmers' Party candidates, tended to advise their voters to transfer down the docket to Cumann na Gael for their lower preference votes. Now, some of the independent farmers' candidates did advocate for a strong party that could hold the balance of power between larger blocks rather than simply orientating towards Cumann na Gael, and this would have some importance later. And in many ways, the campaigns of the various candidates were more individual in nature than they were organised in that normal party fashion that we understand. So what of media coverage then? Well, like in 1927, De Valera and Fianna Fáil received significant criticism from both the Irish Independent newspaper and the Irish Times newspaper. And for many of you, you might naturally assume, and it's understandable, the Irish Independent tended to gravitate towards Cumann na Gael, and up until this point, at any rate, the Irish Times had been traditionally seen as a unionist supporting or unionist sympathising newspaper. So both of them were rather negative in their coverage of Fianna Fáil, and relatively positive, at least in the case of the Irish Independent at any rate, of Cumann na Gael, which received quite sympathetic coverage. But De Valera did not make the same mistake he had made in 1927 in not having a major publication that would support him. And so prior to the 1932 election, he had established the Irish Press, a newspaper which was a daily newspaper and was going to try and rival the Irish Independent, certainly as best it could, and adopted a strong Fianna Fáil line. And why wouldn't it, given that Mr. De Valera essentially ran the newspaper? So that was the case with the media coverage. So how did things transpire? Well, as you can see, there was an essential upending of the political status quo, or of the political situation after the 1932 election. Fianna Fáil returned with 72 seats, which was an increase of 15. And as you can see there, their first preference vote had increased by 9% to 44. Cumann na Gael returned with 57 seats, but there was a decrease in their vote of 3.4%. Now, and they received a general vote, first preference vote of 35.3%. Now, you might assume, based on a decrease of first preference vote of just 3.4%, that Cumann na Gael had actually done reasonably well in the election, given the difficulty they had faced with the economic difficulties and the popularity of Fianna Fáil and the push for change. But in actual fact, some of the vote which they received in this election had actually been vote which they had siphoned away, if you will, from the old National League vote and the elements of the Farmers' Party vote which had switched to them. So in actual fact, in a way, Cumann na Gael, it wasn't that they had done reasonably well despite the circumstances. They had actually cannibalised some of the other right-wing vote and were actually just running to stand still at this stage. The Labour Party, they returned with 7 seats, which was a decrease on 6 from the previous outing, and well, again, this was very disappointing for the Labour Party, and you could argue that it seems surprising they got such a poor seat tally given that their first preference vote only decreased by 1.4%. But the reality was that a lot of the vote which they received was for personality. So very specific Labour men, and they were all men, received a high vote in their particular constituency, which buoyed their first preference vote there, but they got a very poor vote overall in the rest of the constituencies. The Farmers' Party returned with 3, even though again they were a group that was basically on the way out and dissolving, and Independents returned with 14 in this particular election. Okay, so it had essentially reversed the position of the major parties in the Dáil, with Fianna Fáil now being the largest party, but it would require a majority of 77 for a majority, and of course they only had 72. However, even before there was the potentiality for discussions for a potential coalition or for Fianna Fáil to try and find some assistance from elsewhere, perhaps from the Labour Party, there was an arguable threat of a counter-revolution, if you will, or the threat of a potential coup d'etat. And this was in the guise of this man here, Séan Ó Duibhir, who was then the chief of he was the Garda Commissioner, and he was, it seems anyway, based on the evidence of some sources, including his most recent biographer, he was eager to try and prevent a Fianna Fáil government from coming to power, because he was quite concerned about the consequences of a De Valera-led administration, both for the country and for himself personally, as he was the chief of police and of Gardaí, which had prosecuted so many of De Valera's old friends, and indeed De Valera himself in the past. However, this fear of a coup d'etat, it never gained any legs. It was only someone like Séan Ó Duibhir and a few other malcontents within the Irish army who had gave it any consideration. Someone like W.T. Cosgrave, the outgoing president of the Executive Council, would have squashed any such idea, and it would never have taken any legs, as I say. However, there were fears of it there were fears of such a possibility from within the Fianna Fáil opposition. And they were concerned that Cosgrave and Cumann na Gael would prevent De Valera from becoming president of the Executive Council, or Taoiseach in our modern parlance. With the result that, as James Dillon indicated, and James Dillon was a fresh independent TD who had been just elected. He was the son of John Dillon, who had been the last leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, and he was not someone positively disposed towards either of the old Sinn Féin parties. He didn't particularly like Cumann na Gael, he didn't particularly like Fianna Fáil, but on his first day in the Dáil, he noted the stress and the strain amongst many of the Fianna Fáil delegates, and he claimed a very considerable number of the Fianna Fáil party arrived in the Dáil armed to the teeth. They thought there was going to be a putsch, that if Mr. De Valera was elected, Mr. Cosgrave wouldn't hand over government. So they were swaggering around the place with revolvers bulging out of their pockets. One old gentleman was assembling a machine gun in a telephone booth within Leinster House. So that gives you an indication that there was genuine fear, even if it wasn't justified on the part of Fianna Fáil. So, on the 9th of March, as a consequence of negotiations essentially between Fianna Fáil and the Labour Party, De Valera was elected president of the Executive Council, and for the first time an anti-Treatyite party, Fianna Fáil, was now in the governing position in the state. So this was a new broom, but it wasn't the feared clean sweep that some worried about. So for instance, the new Fianna Fáil government did not engage in any purge of civil servants or of the Gardaí or of the army, and they didn't even fire Séan Ó Duibhir yet at this point in time. De Valera appointed as Minister for Justice a man called James Geoghegan, or Geoghegan depending on your pronunciation, and he was seen as something of a conciliatory choice, because he was a former Cumann na Gael supporter himself and had only switched to Fianna Fáil in the latter part of the 1920s. So this was seen as a kind of a middle-of-the-road guy to put in that sensitive Department of Justice. Now, De Valera did fulfill one of his promises of releasing all the anti-treaty IRA prisoners, which was an issue that had created some difficulty or some concern for pro-Treatyites and for Cumann na Gael both before and after the election. But in reality, there were only 17 prisoners in jail anyway for the anti-treaty IRA at that point in time, so it wasn't exactly a huge deluge of dangerous subversives that were all being let out on one day. However, at the time, De Valera still was clear in his indication that notwithstanding his somewhat less harsh approach, obviously, towards the anti-treaty IRA, vis-a-vis his predecessors, he was of the view that there is still only one government and one army. And what he meant by one government was his government, and what he meant by one army was the Irish army. Now, De Valera also, or the government, the Fianna Fáil government, also suspended Article 2A, as it was known. This was that public safety, it's another name for that Public Safety Act I mentioned earlier that Cumann na Gael had introduced in 1931. De Valera suspended it. As I say, Fianna Fáil had always opposed it and regarded it as draconian. So he suspended it, but he didn't repeal it, and this would be important later. But it was seen as, again, decreasing the security tension or the security concerns. His initial budgetary policy was arguably more conservative than expected. It wasn't a crazy splurge, as it were, but there were tax increases. There were some tax increases and some cuts to civil service pay as well. And however, on the other side, on the more populist side, if you will, there were investments in housing and unemployment schemes, all of which pleased the Labour Party. Indeed, it was a factor in the Labour Party agreeing to vote De Valera as Taoiseach in the first place. But this largely chimed with Fianna Fáil's stated aims at any rate, so this wasn't, they hadn't given a sop to the Labour Party, as it were. Now, the new government was very quick to test boundaries, particularly the boundaries of sovereignty, self-sufficiency, and with respect to subversives. So in July 1932, De Valera, or the government fulfilled its promise to no longer pay the land annuities to Britain, mentioned them already, and so in July of that year, the Free State defaulted on its land annuity payments to Britain. So De Valera still collected the annuities from farmers, but kept them here. He didn't send them over to London, as it were. And the British immediately responded to this by putting taxes and tariffs or duties on a lot of Irish exports to Britain, specifically, of course, agricultural exports. And this was to spark off what was known generally as the economic war, in which the Irish government, in response to the British government putting taxes and tariffs on our goods, the Irish government now put more taxes and tariffs on incoming British goods. Now, this economic war was to have significant negative effects for certain sections of Irish society, particularly farmers, and in particular middling farmers, and also larger farmers, as they're generally known, sometimes disparagingly known as big farmers. And it was to create economic difficulty in the country for a period of time, no doubt. But this arguably suited De Valera and Fianna Fáil's, or at least certainly De Valera's perspective at any rate, of trying to reorder the economic life of Irish society, to move it away from a dependency on exports to Britain and to try to, again, as I say, build up and encourage those native Irish industries to create products that would replace the expensive products that were coming from Britain because of the taxes that the Irish government were now putting on them. So the economic war had a certain kind of suited De Valera's nationalist agenda, because it was against Britain, but it also suited his economic agenda to a certain extent. He also attempted to remove the oath, as I say, the repugnant, as they saw it, oath of allegiance or oath of fidelity to the British monarch. He introduced a bill to that effect in the Dáil, but it was effectively stymied by the Seanad. The Seanad being the second house of government or parliament at that time, which was predominantly populated at that stage still by pro-Cumann na Gael and indeed some pro-unionist elements, and so they postponed this, or they prevented this legislation to remove the oath from being implemented for a period of time. He also sidelined and then eventually replaced the Governor-General. This is a symbol of sovereignty again. The Governor-General was essentially the King's representative in Ireland. He did the same job as our President does today, signs bills into law or rejects them if he thinks they're not appropriate. Much the same scenario. I mean, there are differences, but you take my meaning here. But this was seen again as an imposition by the British. This person was the King's representative. So from Fianna Fáil's perspective, they wanted to sideline this position and ultimately get rid of it. So in the meantime, they sidelined the then Attorney General, a guy called MacNeill, and James MacNeill, and he so much so that he resigned. He got fed up with being mistreated, as he saw it, or disrespected by the government, and then De Valera put in his own man, a guy called Donald O'Bucla, as Governor-General, who basically did whatever De Valera said, to make a long story short. Now, there was also engagement between some elements of the Fianna Fáil hierarchy and the anti-treaty IRA during this period between the two elections, an attempt to try and convince the anti-treaty IRA to completely give up its violent ways, to recognise the state now that it had a new Fianna Fáil anti-Treatyite leader, and to essentially get the organisation to dissolve. But this was largely unsuccessful in terms of getting the organisation to dissolve. However, De Valera did decriminalise the anti-treaty IRA at this time, which allowed it to operate openly, and he also offered inducements to many of its members to move away from the organisation at the same time. So he provided pensions for people who've been involved in the War of Independence, and some of them were in the anti-treaty IRA now, in exchange for them leaving behind the organisation. And he also created a new volunteer reserve force to be attached to the Irish Army, which would help to encourage young men, generally young men who might be enticed into the anti-treaty IRA or were already in it, to leave it and to join this new state-run with some payment, some state-run and subsidised voluntary reserve force. Okay, so challenges. However, he still had challenges. There continued to be, as I say, anti-treaty IRA activity with open drilling. And during this period between the two elections, of 1932 and 1933, there was some intimidation of treatyites, if you will, or intimidation of Cumann people or Cumann politicians. There was, I suppose, a certain degree of retribution being exacted from elements of the anti-treaty IRA towards what they saw as the old Cosgrave gang and its supporters. So this was creating some security difficulties in the mid to latter part of 1932. The economic war also disgruntled quite a few farmers, for reasons I don't need to outline to you, which meant now that quite a few farmers refused to pay their annuities to the De Valera government because they could not sell their produce in Britain because of the high tax and tariffs that were being placed on Irish exports to Britain. They felt, these farmers, that and because they saw it as De Valera's fault for starting the economic war, they felt that they should not have to pay their annuities to the Irish government. So this increased agrarian agitation and often resulted in the Gardaí having to go in and confiscate livestock, etc., of farmers who were refusing to pay their legally due annuities to the government. Some ministers, including Sean Lemass, who would be a stalwart supporter of Eamon De Valera, began to have doubts about the economic war towards the end of 1932 and was actually almost lobbying for it to be ended by De Valera. So he did experience some pushback even within Fianna Fáil with respect to the economic war. And then concerns began to grow in the Labour Party, which of course supported the government, at least supported the government in the vote to place De Valera as President of the Executive Council. They began to have concerns at what they saw as Fianna Fáil's lethargy in terms of implementing various programmes and responses to the difficulties imposed by the economic war. Labour were on the fence in relation to the economic war, as it were. They were in favour of it, provided it was handled the right way, essentially. But one of the issues that they felt De Valera didn't move on was to break up the ranches. This was an ideal opportunity, as Labour saw it, for Fianna Fáil during the economic war to break up the big ranches of the big farmers and redistribute that land. And Fianna Fáil were quite hesitant to engage in that kind of form of social revolution. So, in large part, due to these increasing tensions, coupled with the fact that Fianna Fáil didn't have its own majority, remember it was relying on the Labour Party to maintain a majority in Parliament after the 1932 election, and also because of the government's intention to introduce a measure to cut again to cut the cost of public servants' cost of living, essentially bonuses, in December 1932, again to deal with the budgetary issue. This was the final straw for the Labour Party, essentially, who told the government told Fianna Fáil that they were going to vote against any such measure. And so De Valera saw this as his ideal opportunity to dissolve the Dáil and have a snap election and go back to the country again to get a fresh mandate. However, just before this occurred, there was a kind of a potential realignment of the opposition, which De Valera's, either intentionally or otherwise, De Valera's decision to call an election in January 1933, just 10 months after entering power, this realignment was forestalled as a consequence of De Valera's snap election decision. So this was where people like W.T. Cosgrave, the leader of Cumann na Gael, but also this man here, Frank McDermott, who was an independent TD at this point, but he'd been elected on a kind of a farming ticket as a representative of the National Farming and Ratepayers Organisation. And this man here, another independent TD who I mentioned already, James Dillon, kind of an independent nationalist, but very involved in agricultural issues as well. Both of these men, James Dillon and Frank McDermott, had been flirting with the idea of creating a new political party, but they'd also been flirting with the idea of a realignment between themselves and Cumann na Gael, although James Dillon was particularly opposed, or was less enthusiastic about joining up with an old Sinn Féin party as he saw it. But in any event, whatever potentiality there was for a realignment involving both the Cumann na Gael party and these independent farming elements, that was forestalled or it was prevented by this snap election. That wasn't going to happen. But what did happen was these two men, Dillon and McDermott, they formed their own little smaller party, which became known as the National Centre Party. And that was formed just 3 days after the election was called. And I'll refer to them again later, or towards the end of the lecture. So on the dissolution of the Dáil then, in January 1933, Fianna Fáil had 71 seats at this stage. They had lost one due to a TD passing away. Cumann na Gael had 54 seats. The Labour Party had 7. The Farmers' Party had who were still technically in existence, had 3. And even though, again, some of them were going to move into another dispensation soon. And the Independents had 14 at this point in time. So the 1933 campaign itself then, well, as Brian Fanning has stated, the late Professor Brian Fanning, this was arguably the most bitter, turbulent and colourful campaign in independent Ireland. It was also quite violent, with significant numbers of anti-treaty IRA members and militant Fianna Fáil supporters indeed, often haranguing and harassing Cumann na Gael and indeed some centre party events, the National Centre Party, which I'll mention in a moment. So in terms of the campaign then, the Fianna Fáil campaign was largely a reproduction of the previous one. Again, although on this occasion they were now in government, so they emphasised the need for a strong government, return us with a strong government in order to prevent economic instability and societal instability, etc. They stated they will continue to work to abolish the oath. They said that they would continue to retain the land annuities, but they would reduce the cost to the farmers of the annuities by 50%. This was their inducement at this point in time. They again stated they would build up native industries. They would expand tillage, moving away from the export market of cattle, and expand the tillage, production of tillage here in Ireland in order to feed Irish people with domestic produced tillage here. And they would continue to curtail waste in public expenditure. So it was basically just almost a carbon copy of their previous campaign, with 1 or 2 additions, aside from the 50% reduction in annuities, of course. They also promised on this occasion that if returned to power, they would attempt to abolish the seanad outright, which they saw effectively as a creature of Cumann na Gael and also, in effect, an imposition of the British in some respects. And they also promised to try and reduce the number of TDs. That's generally a popular one too at election time when it's thrown out by opposition candidates. De Valera still remained prominent in the campaign in a presidential type figure, that centrifugal force again, as I say. And his campaign, or De Valera himself, very much promoted concepts of sovereignty. Let's fight the economic war in order to bolster our sovereignty, in addition to reordering the economic nature of society, and on patriotic grounds, of course, as well, the economic war was promoted. They also questioned, again, Cumann na Gael's patriotism and implied that it was effectively in collusion with the British in order to try and undermine the Fianna Fáil government. And some Fianna Fáil candidates also denounced the new Centre Party that I mentioned, or the National Centre Party, claiming that support for the Centre Party was support for the British Empire, in essence. The Labour Party largely escaped recriminations from Fianna Fáil, despite the falling out at the end, because partially, I suppose, De Valera would have known he could be relying on Labour again, depending on how things worked out at the end of the election. And he advised, and Fianna Fáil candidates tended to advise transfers to Labour Party candidates. And again, the Fianna Fáil campaign was heavily assisted by the anti-treaty IRA or anti-treaty IRA elements. Now, the Cumann na Gael campaign, on this occasion, they adopted a presidential style, and in focusing on Cosgrave as a man of honour, of principle and consistency. So they tried to adopt the De Valera approach, if you will. And they brought about a slightly more positive campaign, I think it's fair to say. There was an expectation, unwarranted as we know now, that they would simply return to office. There was a view amongst many in Cumann na Gael that the people realised the mistake they'd made in electing De Valera, with respect to the economic war, which Cumann and Gael were obviously opposed to. And they expected they'd be returned to office. So there was probably a certain degree of lethargy there as well in some respects. They promised to end the economic war in 3 days if they were returned to office. And they also promised a 2-year moratorium on the annuities. So everyone was getting in on this Land Annuities Act and how popular it might be with certain sections of society to decrease them, abolish them, or put a moratorium on them. And they also employed an advertising company which even featured W.T. Cosgrave, the first parliamentarian here to be featured in a talkie film, in other words, a film where you could hear the person's voice. The Labour campaign, and this man here was the new leader of the Labour Party at this time, a guy called William Norton, or Bill Norton. He had taken over essentially from T.J. O'Connell, who actually, I don't think I mentioned it, he'd also lost his seat in the 1932 election. So after that, William Norton became the leader of the Labour Party. And he's the one who initiated or engaged in the negotiations with De Valera over the confidence and supply arrangement, if you will. So Labour claimed the credit for many of the outgoing government social and economic reforms. They basically said these are Labour reforms. The reason why they're so good is because, and house building, etc., is because we pushed Fianna Fáil to do it. They played their own version on occasion of the Green Card, claiming that the most foreign thing in Ireland is the capitalist system and it should be routed. However, its funding and organisation was very poor. It had very low resources, and it had a very lethargic, as I say, and not a very activist organisational base, and it only ran 19 candidates in this election. And again, it advertised itself essentially as a potential watchdog. Vote for us so we can get a few people in and keep a larger government party in check. So, somewhat lacklustre campaign again, despite having a much more vibrant and young leader. And then the National Centre Party, as I mentioned already. This was the organisation that was formed by those elements such as James Dillon and Frank McDermott. And they also brought in along with them certain members of the former members of the Farmers' Party and some independents who were minded to try and find a different type of party, one that wasn't Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael or indeed Labour, because they weren't particularly left-wing, many of these elements here for the National Centre Party. So it also took in some ex-unionists as well, and indeed arguably attracted some disgruntled Cumann and Gael voters as well. Their platform was essentially one of, and as I say, it was formed 3 days after the election was called. Their platform was essentially one of also opposing the economic war. They adopted a pro-Commonwealth position, very much a pro-Commonwealth position, arguing that the best way to end partition was through consent with the people of Northern Ireland, which is, in fairness, was reasonably forward-thinking because every party accepts that now, I think it's fair to say, bar a few minor ones. And they argued that the best way of ending it was within the Commonwealth, that they could get the Unionists to join them by remaining an active member of the British Commonwealth. They saw themselves as the middle ground between the two Sinn Féin parties, but ultimately there would be some significant sympathy within the National Centre Party for Cumann and Gael as opposed to Fianna Fáil. And they were largely associated, as I say, with farming issues in the popular mind. And thus, because of their alleged or perceived sympathy, which was arguably accurate for Cumann and Gael, they suffered from both rhetorical attack from Fianna Fáil and sometimes physical attack from some Fianna Fáil supporters and from elements of the anti-treaty IRA. And indeed, quite a few of the National Centre Party candidates would have advised putting their lower preference transfers to Cumann and Gael. However, it also suffered from a lack of funds and fielded just 26 candidates in that election. So they were basically putting themselves in the same position as Labour, as a watchdog, but on the right-hand side of the spectrum, if you will. So the media coverage of this election was similar to the previous year. The Irish Independent was very pro-Cumann and Gael, and to a certain extent the Centre Party. The Irish Press was obviously pro-Fianna Fáil, and the Irish Times was quite clear in its preference as well, stating on election day, Mr. Cosgrave has 10 years of solid achievement to his credit. Mr. De Valera has 10 months of ruinous muddling. Mr. De Valera will abolish the Senate, snap his fingers in Great Britain's face and lead a broken nation forward to hungry independence. So I think it's quite clear what direction the Irish Times was taking here. And as I say, this particular election was one that had a significant amount of aggression, intimidation, violence and disorder. It was, as Brian Fanning said, the most bitter in the state's history. And it's arguable that a rather emboldened anti-treaty IRA, which had actually seen its membership increase for a period after the accession of Fianna Fáil to power, felt rather emboldened by Fianna Fáil's victory and were trying to exact this sense of retribution against what they saw as the old Cosgrave gang. And operating under the kind of the general catch cry of no free speech for traitors. This was the catch cry that was uttered by a lot of anti-treaty IRA men, and I think was actually featured in the An Phoblacht newspaper, which was the newspaper owned and controlled effectively by the anti-treaty IRA. They were basically claiming that people like Cosgrave and Cumann na Gael candidates, they're traitors, and therefore free speech is not something they're entitled to. This, you could argue, was a very early form of violent cancel culture, which we're all somewhat familiar with today. So no free speech for traitors was their argument, and they felt they were legitimately entitled to go to Cumann na Gael meetings, both before and during the election campaign, and to try and prevent them from taking place, or to try and disrupt them and to cause problems. So there was significant levels of violence as a consequence at Cumann na Gael gatherings, and at some centre party gatherings as well, because the anti-treaty IRA and other militant Fianna Fáil elements as well, not just the anti-treaty IRA, but there were some militant Fianna Fáil supporters, also saw the centre party as basically a creature of the British, or as pro-British, etc. This led to a reaction. It led to the rise of a group known as you see them here in a later incarnation as the Blueshirts. It led to a group known as the Army Comrades Association coming to the fore. Now the Army Comrades Association, and they came to the fore in opposition to the anti-treaty IRA. Now the ACA had been formed actually a year before this. They were formed even before the 1932 election, and ostensibly their purpose was to promote the well-being of former members of the old IRA before the treaty split, and of the Irish Army, retirees from the Irish Army. And they also indicated that their objective was to promote the state and to uphold the state, the democratic nature of the state. This was the ostensible anyway, and stated purpose of the ACA. But it very quickly, or very soon, and particularly as a consequence of the violence of the being perpetrated by the anti-treaty side, if you will, during this campaign in 1933, they began to form very much into a paramilitary organisation, the ACA. And they fought the anti-treaty IRA on the streets and at meetings where the anti-treaty IRA or militant Fianna Fáil supporters would turn up. And in later years, the ACA, as you know, or subsequently the ACA would evolve or transmogrify or morph, whatever term you want to use, into what became known as the Blueshirts. And because of all this violence that was occurring, and because it appeared to many Cumann na Gaelers and other pro-treatyites that the Gardaí, or the forces of the state, were not attempting to prevent the anti-treaty IRA from engaging in this form of intimidation, they ended up believing that De Valera was allowing it to happen, and that De Valera was thus in effect trying to implement or allow to emerge some form of dictatorship with him at the head, an anti-Treatyite dictatorship. And indeed, it would be, De Valera himself would later claim, when he was asked about this in the Dáil, why haven't you done more to protect our meetings or protect Cumann na Gael meetings and to prevent the anti-treaty IRA or militant supporters from causing trouble? He said that it is not the government's job to make the opposition popular. That was his argument. Now, that's a fair argument. It's not the government's job to make an opposition popular, but it's probably reasonable to say it is a government's job to make sure an opposition should be physically safe in a democracy. So these were the two varying perspectives, I guess, on that. So what was the outcome then of that election? Don't worry, folks, we are approaching the end. So the outcome of that particular election was to see Fianna Fáil returned with a bare majority, or a technical majority at any rate. Contrary to the hopes of Cumann na Gael, and some others indeed, Fianna Fáil were not routed by the people. They were not rejected by the people. In actual fact, their vote increased and their support increased. So Fianna Fáil increased their vote share by 5.2%, as you can, just over 5% there, to close to 50% of the first preference vote, and they returned with an extra 5 seats, giving them that exact 77 that's required for a majority. Cumann na Gael had a very disappointing election again, losing 9 seats on this occasion, down to 49, even though they only lost 4 or so % of the vote on this occasion. But as a consequence of, I suppose, arguably poor seat organisation, they had lost once again. But there was also an element of their support base which had been attracted to the National Centre Party, that new group that I just mentioned. The National Centre Party returned with 11 seats on a first preference vote of just over 9%. And again, as I say, some of that vote came from the Old Farmers' Party, others of it came from some of the former independents, including some ex-unionists, but a not insignificant section of it came from Cumann na Gael. The Labour Party returned with an increase on their outgoing scenario. They had 7, but they had 7 going into the election, but returned with 8, an increase in 1, despite having a decrease in their first preference vote. So again, this was probably due to the fact that they ran less candidates, which meant they could focus on certain constituencies, and they benefited from Fianna Fáil transfers lower down the ballot paper, which helped them to get that one extra seat over the line. And then there were 9 independents of various and often vociferous perspectives returned to this particular Dáil as well. So Fianna Fáil government is returned at the end of the 1933 election. On the 8th of February of that year, De Valera, despite the predictions or the hopes of Cumann and some others, including the Irish Times obviously, that he would not be re-elected, he in fact was once more appointed President of the Executive Council following a successful vote of 82 votes to 54 in Parliament. On that particular occasion, the Centre Party abstained, and so therefore the vote share, or the discrepancy between the votes seems higher as a consequence. Okay, so the consequences of these two elections then can be broadly separated into the 1932 and 1933 elections. In the 1932 election, one of the consequences was it demonstrated that Fianna Fáil could govern both to its detractors and to its supporters. The period after that election, where De Valera was relying on Labour for votes, it convinced him of the need to bolster his mandate and probably, and thus to move to another election swiftly, but it also probably contributed to what would be a later, at least in part, Fianna Fáil dislike of coalitions, and they would not enter any form of a formal coalition, Fianna Fáil, until the late 1980s. It also, as we saw, emboldened the behaviour and the attitude of the anti-treaty IRA, who began to become aggressive during 1932 and would become even more aggressive after the 1933 election. It forced the primary opposition elements to consider at least new options in 1932. Do you remember I mentioned Cumann and the guys who would become the Centre Party were at least considering a reorientation of the opposition to Fianna Fáil and De Valera prior to the calling of that snap election in 1933. So the consequences of the 1933 election then was that it resulted in the consolidation of Fianna Fáil power, as we have seen, with the result that Fianna Fáil would, but of course due to winning more elections, remain in power for the next 15 years. It gave De Valera a clear mandate for constitutional change, to broaden Irish sovereignty, to abolish the oath, which he ultimately did, to abolish the Seanad, which he ultimately did, and it also placed him in a better position to increase Ireland's position in international affairs. And it was during this period, or this Dáil term from 1933 to 1937, in which De Valera was one of the primary people who formulated the new constitution, the new Bunreacht na hÉireann, which was enacted in 1937 and which we still live under today. Now, the election also prolonged the economic war, because it was to continue until 1938, essentially, before finally an agreement was made with the British to end the economic war. But arguably, it also facilitated Irish neutrality subsequently during the Second World War. Because at the time we ended the economic war with Britain in 1938, some of you may know, De Valera managed to inveigle the British government at the time to return the 3 treaty ports of 2 in Southern Ireland and 1 in Donegal, 2 in Cork and 1 in Donegal, which had been kept by the British Army or the British Navy since 1922. And because those ports were returned to the Irish state, it meant the Irish state was now capable of being a neutral state, if it wished to be, when the Second World War arrived in 1939, because there would be no reason, for instance, or arguably no reason for an attack to be made on a neutral Irish state by the German or the Axis powers, if you will, given that there was no British Army presence on it or no British Navy presence. And it's arguable that if Fianna Fáil had not been returned to power in 1933, the economic war would not have continued, and therefore there's no guarantee, arguably, that a Cumann administration would have got those ports back or maintained a neutral stance, for that matter, either in the Second World War. Now, of course, whether one wants to regard our neutrality as positive or negative is a different question, but the reality of its occurrence is due to, in large part, the aftermath of this election. There was also an increase, again, as I say, in anti-treaty IRA violence between themselves and the emerging Blueshirts, which morphed out of the Army Comrades Association. This was to result in significant security difficulties and a potential threat to democracy, as De Valera was to see it during the 1930s. I won't go into it in depth here, don't worry. But ultimately, De Valera's reaction to the Blueshirts, or the threat which he saw from them, together with his later reaction to the anti-treaty IRA after 1936, which he also saw as a major threat, meant that Fianna Fáil was to become a law and order party after 1933, focusing on defending the state, maintaining its democratic structures, and preventing attacks upon it from all comers. But of course this helped by virtue of the fact it was now De Valera's eyes a Fianna Fáil-ish type state at any rate. And lastly, the 1933 election propelled the reorganisation of the opposition. With the defeat, the significant defeat for Cumann na Gael, if you will, they lost about 17 seats over the course of 2 elections now. The difficulties faced by the Centre Party organisation and to a certain extent the elements of the Blueshirts who felt that they were being unfairly treated by Fianna Fáil security legislation, forced all of these groups to try and form a common cause against what they saw as Fianna Fáil's overreach in power, and resulted in the formation of a new party consisting where Cumann na Gael, the Centre Party and the Blueshirts, if you will, came together and formed a new organisation called the United Ireland Party, although more popularly known as Fine Gael. And despite some brief flirtations by the leadership, the first leader of that party, Séan Ó Duibhir, with fascism, he was in reasonably short order. 1 year after becoming the leader of the party, Séan Ó Duibhir, the former chief of police, as it were, he was forced out of Fine Gael. And again, despite these, as I say, these brief enough flirtations with para-fascism or pseudo-fascism, the Fine Gael party settled down to become a very constitutional and reasonably middle-of-the-road opposition party for the next 15 years before they finally had a chance to return to government. Okay, so in conclusion, I promise, in conclusion, in his assessment of Eamon de Valera's political trajectory and eventual ascent to power in 1932, his biographer, David McCullough, has observed, it was a stunning recovery from apparent political oblivion that would leave other Lazarus acts, such as Winston Churchill, Richard Nixon, and Charles Haughey, in the shade. In his decade in the wilderness, he had been a reluctant soldier, a defeated rebel, a despised prisoner. He had built a political party and then split it when he failed to get his way. He had founded another political movement, as well as a national newspaper. He had led his followers from the margins to the centre of the Free State political system by taking an oath he had sworn never to take, and he had repeatedly defied predictions that he was finished. Indeed, De Valera, as we saw in this lecture, was far from finished. He was only really beginning a second political life. The 2 hard-fought and quite fraught elections that occurred in rapid succession in 1932 and 1933 were contests that initially, if a little shakily, brought what one could term constitutional anti-treatyism to power in the Free State, leading, as we know, to a further 15 years of Fianna Fáil governance. This heralded an unbroken period in power that would see significant economic, political and constitutional change, as De Valera, arguably the most consequential, if not necessarily the most loved politician in the history of independent Ireland, set about remoulding the Irish state so as to match his idealised vision of the Irish nation. And given the rather fraught, febrile and sometimes violent nature of these 2 contests, the title for this evening's talk, There Must Be Order, was, I would argue, particularly apt. And all the more so because it is a phrase that dropped, not as one might first suspect, thoughtlessly from the lips of some conservative Cumann na Gael minister fulminating against anti-Treatyite paramilitarism, but rather because it was a phrase uttered in a very conscious, careful and calibrated way by Eamon de Valera himself, who accepted that in 1930s Ireland, political legitimacy could only be achieved via the ballot box, and who also understood that, once in government, the maintenance of the rule of law and the protection of Irish democratic structures had now become Fianna Fáil's responsibility. Indeed, due in no small part to the events of, and those which proceeded from, the 1932 and 1933 general elections, the law and order mantle was one that Fianna Fáil governments were to take on with a level of commitment, tenacity and sometimes sheer ruthlessness that matched any previous Cumann na Gael administration. Indeed, by the end of the decade, it was evident that De Valera himself had donned the rhetorical cloak of his late adversary Kevin O'Higgins when he, De Valera, expressed his own interpretation of Salus Republicae Suprema Lex. Quote, "The law will be enforced against them, the anti-treaty IRA. If the present law is not sufficient, it will be strengthened, And in the last resort, if no other law will suffice, then the government will invoke the ultimate law, the safety of the people. Thank you very much for your time and for listening.